The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken is due to visit Israel this week as part of efforts to extend the current truce. He will also travel to the West Bank there, meet with the Palestinian leaders. For more on this, let's speak to Wits University's international relations analyst, Professor Glaser. A very good evening to you, Professor. Good to have your time. So, the trip by Blinken is not the first in the 7 or so weeks since those first attacks on October 7th. Does it add anything to the process as far as the pursuit of a longer-lasting truce?
Well, I mean, Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has been shuttling frantically around that whole region, trying to secure the cooperation of Arab and other regional players, trying to persuade them to cooperate with the objectives of American foreign policy. I think so far it's been largely frustrating. I think in some of his first shuttles he was trying to persuade Arab leaders to condemn the Hamas atrocities. He was trying to get them to endorse the so-called Israeli right to self-defense. He was even he and other American diplomats were even trying to persuade Arab leaders to facilitate the evacuation of Gaza's population into the Sinai Desert, which would effectively have amounted to another great Nakba or catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Arab leaders who normally these days are reluctant to take a strong stand against Israel, they did draw a red line at facilitating that mass evacuation of Gaza's population. So I think that Blinken and the Americans' objectives have changed somewhat. Partly it's changed because although the United States gave Israel initially and still does give Israel a green light and effectively a blank check to pursue its extremely brutal war in Gaza, I think the Americans have probably been surprised by some of the pushback they've got from various groups around the world who have called for a ceasefire or have accused Israel of genocide, including some groups inside, for example, the Democratic Party base or congressional aides or senior bureaucrats in the United States. I think the Americans the American leadership assumed that it would be cost-free politically to simply back Israel unconditionally, but they've discovered, for example, that they're in serious danger of losing Michigan in the presidential election because of Arabs and Muslims in that marginal state not voting. So I think the Americans, plus I think they've been the Americans have been somewhat embarrassed and horrified by for example, Israel's use of 2,000-pound bombs in heavily populated areas. These are munitions much more powerful than the Americans, for example, used in Mosul. And so I think the Americans are somewhat embarrassed about this, and they've, as it were, slightly changed tack and have tried to get Israel to moderate its positions by allowing in aid or agreeing to temporary pauses. But America is still having to carry the can in the region for having green-lighted this Israeli war. And this is extremely unpopular in the region. And I think part of what the Americans are doing is to try and sort of assuage the anger in the region.
And how successful will Blinken be at that when the Americans have clearly picked a side? They've said that they support and, in fact, endorse Israel, they say, is right and duty to defend itself and its citizens, even though we're seeing that in the process to kill off Hamas, thousands of civilians in Gaza have not been spared. During his last visit to the region, Blinken himself was shunned by some of the Arab leaders who simply refused to meet with him, including the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. So will he have to climb down from some of what he's said since the beginning of this war in order to be able to get them to give him a proper hearing, if you will?
Well, look, I think there's a certain amount of rhetorical backtracking by the Americans. They are sounding, they're placing somewhat greater emphasis on their requirement that Israel should observe some of the rules of war and so on. I mean, whether there's any substance behind these rhetorical shifts is highly debatable. America is still effectively refusing to place any conditions, while it's trying to coax Israel into pursuing a more sort of a surgical or targeted kind of war, the American government's refusing to place any conditions on Israel, any serious pressure on Israel. So, look, I mean, when it comes to the region, there's a bit of a split between the Arab elites and their population. So a lot of Arab governments, some of the Gulf states, some of the autocrats in the region were in the process of normalizing or had normalized relations with Israel prior to October the 7th. They actually see all sorts of advantages in getting closer to Israel. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, what happened on October the 7th has upset their plans, because they're now having to deal with populations that are much more hostile to Israel, especially as they react to Israel's violent campaign in the West Bank. It's important to realize that, prior to October the 7th, the objective of both the Netanyahu government and successive American governments was to effectively erase the Palestinian issue. There used to be a sense that in order for Israel to integrate itself into the region, it would have to make serious concessions to the Palestinians. Basically, Netanyahu said, forget about that. I'm going to get normalized relations with the region without making any concessions to the Palestinians. And some Arab countries seem to be playing along with that Netanyahu agenda. But now those Arab states are finding it much more difficult to play along with the Netanyahu/US agenda because of the opposition, the aroused opposition, the mobilized opposition of their own people to Israel's military campaign in Gaza.
And those normalization talks, as we know, have now been put on hold. In fact, in Iran, there's been a stronger call there because they are long-time foes to the Israelis. They had, in fact, wanted all sort of ties to be severed, at least for the time being of this war. But I want to talk about another country in the region, Qatar, small in population, but seemingly growing as far as its diplomatic influence. When you look at the situation in Afghanistan, how it's played a role between the Americans and the Iranians in recent times, and now in this process in negotiating not only the initial temporary ceasefire, but its extension. What is it about the Qataris that's allowed them to play such a crucial role? And what does it mean for America, which had for years positioned itself as, if you will, the broker that would help a peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Have the Qataris now taken that senior role diplomatically?
Well, they're certainly playing an important role. I don't know if they can substitute for the influence of a superpower, but they played a generally quite maverick and interesting role in the region. A lot of the regional powers, the regional governments, are extremely hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood and all organizations associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is one such. Basically, Qatar has been willing to maintain links with those movements, even while also, for example, housing America's largest military base in the Gulf. So it's trying to maintain relations with both sides and gets criticized from both sides. By the one side for being too pro-Muslim Brotherhood, by the other side for being too pro-Western. So, but in fact, it's been able to maintain this kind of balanced position that, in turn, enables it to play a mediating role. So, Qatar has, for example, been, although Israel never negotiates directly with Hamas, through Egypt and through Qatar, it comes to various kinds of arrangements with Hamas, including, for example, the Israeli government before October the 7th was effectively allowing Qatar to finance the Hamas government in Gaza. So, yes, it's playing an interesting and important role because it's maintaining a foot in various camps. But your other point about the United States being discredited, I mean, I think this is definitely a factor. And also the United States, one of the reasons it wanted to normalize relations between Israel and the Arab world is that America's priority was to have peace and quiet in the Middle East. It basically wanted the Palestinian issue to go away because America wanted to turn its attention to Ukraine and to the rivalry with China. And what the the Palestinian, the Gaza breakout did, atrocious as it was in human rights terms, but what it did was to emphatically underline the fact that for any progress towards peace in the region to happen, it has to involve an accommodation, with a genuine accommodation with the Palestinian people.
Right. And President Biden has said, and Blinken is expected to do so again during this visit, that the Americans' position in terms of a longer-term peace remains that there should be work towards a creation or the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Now, whenever that has come up, one of the issues is around how to split it, if you will. Do we go back to the 1967 borders, which Netanyahu has clearly rejected and was so grossly offended, and Barack Obama, in fact, made a similar suggestion about 12 years ago? How will this conversation wash down between the Americans and the Israelis, you think?
You know, we haven't even got to that stage of seriously discussing borders. The position of the current extreme right-wing Israeli government is that it's not interested in a two-state solution. And it's probably going to be even less interested in one, at least in the short term, as a result of what happened on October the 7th. And there will be quite widespread backing amongst Israeli politicians for a fairly hardline stance, or at least that's quite conceivably going to be the case, at least in the short term. I mean, in the medium to longer term, you know, I suppose the events of the last couple of months could break a logjam and cause everybody to realize they need to come to their senses and reach some sort of just solution and just compromise. We're still some way away from that point. So it's very difficult to see the current government in Israel agreeing to a two-state solution of any kind, let alone one along the 67 borders. Yet, of course, the Palestinians couldn't possibly accept a two-state solution that doesn't involve the Palestinians gaining for their state at least the equivalent of the area of the West Bank and Gaza. So, you know, so much is going to depend on whether the Americans are going to continue to chant the two-state solution mantra without really meaning it, without really placing any pressure on Israel to bring it about, or whether the Americans are now going to conclude that they can't cope with the potentially escalating conflict in the region. They can't cope with they don't want to have to cope with repeated outbreaks of conflict in the region, and they might decide that conceivably that they're going to put real pressure on Israel to make concessions. It's very difficult for me to believe that the Americans will put real pressure on Israel. It's just so politically difficult in the United States to do that. And Biden, for one, who's described himself as a Zionist, and I think is passionately a Zionist, is not just the result of the lobbying of pro-Israel groups. I don't think he's going to put much pressure on Israel. But who knows? I mean, this is what's happened in the last, in the period since October the 7th, amounts to one of those potentially quite earth-shaking events that could change the calculations of various parties to this conflict.
Professor Glaser, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight.